Colocaram fogo aqui, ó.
Barely 2 years since the January 6th insurrection here in the US, the Stop the Steal approach to politics has gone global. After rioters invaded several key buildings in the Brazilian capital this week in support of former President Jair Bolsonaro, protesters are now demanding jail for the rioters and for Bolsonaro himself. I was in Brazil to cover the recent elections and have been reporting on Bolsonaro for years. And this insurrection over the weekend, while it was shocking, it wasn't a surprise. We've been expecting something like this to happen for a while, in part because there were so many clear parallels to what happened with Trump in the US. So to get a sense of how these two events are connected and what this means for both Brazil and the US, I wanted to talk to our Deputy DC Bureau Chief, Todd Zwillich, who's been extensively covering the fallout from January 6th. So, Todd, my first question to you is, having covered this story for so long, what went through your head when you saw these images coming out of Brazil over the weekend, which were just, on the surface at least, so very similar to what happened 2 years ago in DC?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, David, it was like watching the same riot. I mean, different, of course, but rioters crashing through barricades in an eerily similar way, using barricades to smash through windows in lawmakers' offices, claiming trophies from those offices and showing them off. All the while, American Stop the Steal figures cheerleading from the sidelines, from the internet, with their slogans about how great it is, what's going on in Brazil. It's just unmistakable. You just really can't get around the similarities of it. And then right away you wonder, having covered the movement and covered January 6th so closely from here, you know, I wanted to ask you, like, where do those similarities come from, do you think? I mean, does it come from sort of active direction or tactical advice from Americans, or are Brazilians that steeped in the imagery and the messaging of January 6th that when they staged their own version of it, they sort of knew what to do and knew how to emulate it?
I think the answer is sort of partially both, you know, to a limited extent, some combination of both. So first of all, the sort of hardcore of Bolsonaro's supporters, right, this right-wing populist mass movement, they are explicitly conscious of what happened in the US on January 6th and of Trump and of MAGA as a movement. And they are openly inspired by it, right? And they'll tell you as much, they've told me as much. I hesitate to make too sweeping a statement about this having been sort of orchestrated from the US. I don't really think it was. But what's true is that there are some very concrete connections between the two movements and between the two camps, right? Bolsonaro world and Trump world are intimately tied together. You know, you have people like Steve Bannon, who has been advising Bolsonaro's family, his inner circle, for years, since before Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. There is clearly a sort of model here, a strategy for how to undermine a democratic electoral process in the interests of the far right that was definitely in some measure emulated by Brazilians after what happened, you know, it's sort of modeled after what happened with Trump in the US.
I mean, and just strategically or even tactically long before this riot took place, or even before our own January 6th took place, Steve Bannon said before Donald Trump's election, we'll win unless corrupt voting machines take it from us. Bolsonaro said the exact same thing. And if you look in the record, you can see tons of similarities like that. And the other thing that struck me is not only this high level sort of sharing of advisors. Bolsonaro's own son, who, as you know, is a legislator there in Brazil, Eduardo, has made repeated trips to the United States. He's met with Trump, he's met with Bannon, it's all over the internet, and he attended what was called the Cyber Symposium in the summer of 2021 in South Dakota, sponsored by the Pillow Guy, Mike Lindell. This was just an absolute fever dream of stolen election conspiracies and corrupt voting machine delusions that seeped its way into American politics. Bannon was there to help spread the message, and Eduardo was there to even give Mike Lindell a gift of a MAGA hat. So those connections are tactical, they're strategic, and they're familial, I guess.
What is definitely a very clear parallel, and is, in my mind, kind of the most important, most consequential part of the story, is this basically poisoning the well that happens intentionally on the part of these extremely influential, powerful political figures, by which I mean poisoning the well of the body politic of the general public against the democratic institutions and electoral processes of their country, making them believe that they've been hijacked, that they've been stolen, and that any result other than the result that favors them is definitionally illegitimate, right? Once you sort of, again, poison the public with that idea, there are consequences. That's part of why this insurrection in Brazil over the weekend was so predictable for us who've been covering not just this election, but Bolsonaro in the years leading up to it, right? This is something that we were all expecting to happen. It was just a matter of when, right? It was like, when is the January 6th style event going to happen? And, once it happened, it was like, well, here we are. It was bound to in one way or another.
And we're struggling with this exact question here. It's a good reminder, actually, because we are in the middle of struggling with this here in the United States. I mean, hundreds of rioters have been charged from January 6th. That's pretty easy. Charging rioters isn't that hard. Now, prosecutors at both the state and federal level are in the sort of decision tree of whether to charge coup plotters, people around Donald Trump, maybe even Donald Trump himself, with crimes. What does it mean to charge a former president with a crime, especially when his political rival is in office? Well, it might undermine faith in the Justice Department, or for some people, in what they think of as the democratic process itself. What if you let that go forward with no consequences? We're struggling with that exact thing, and we're also struggling with just the metastasis of MAGA, right? Like, Trump keeps losing elections. They pretty much lost these midterms, but he has enough control over the Republican Party that his supporters here, after January 6th, the anniversary of it, were exercising even more power in last week's House debacle with Kevin McCarthy. That was MAGA people doing that. That was January 6th, either participants or cheerleaders doing that. They have more power, not less. Trump might not win the next election, but he has the power to tear down the GOP in the process. I mean, is the metastasis that deep in Brazil?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And that is the big question now facing sort of Brazilian politics, is how hard and how fast can the new administration of the new president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, go after the people responsible for this, not just the rioters, but step up the police officers who were complicit in the riots, as was documented in a lot of video footage, the politicians who instigated it, going up to, as everyone is asking, the man himself, Jair Bolsonaro, who's currently, incidentally, in Orlando, Florida. So the question of how Lula and this broad front that has coalesced around him, including elements from the left all the way to the sort of liberal center and the center right even, how will that broad front react to this event? And will it be able to mobilize fast enough and effectively enough to use this as an opportunity to seriously, materially reduce Bolsonarismo as a political force in Brazil, which is something that has not quite happened in the United States. So that, in my mind at least, might be one of the biggest points of divergence between the fallout from January 6th in the US and January 8th in Brazil. That's what I'm going to be keeping an eye on, at least in the months to come.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.